All right, everybody, welcome back to our last seminar for USBG Education Week 2020. Again, some quick housekeeping. Please, everyone, turn your microphones on mute. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. And Megan or the host will get to your answers and ask them out loud. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Megan to give the intro.
Hey guys, another person that doesn't need too much introduction. I'm pleased to introduce Mr. David Bouchard. If you know David, you know he loves clear ice. And for Education Day, we had to do a hands-on activity. And while we're doing it virtually, I couldn't think of a better thing to do that you can do not only at home, but you can also do it and integrate it into your programs. So without further ado, I'm going to give it to David.
Hey everybody, thanks for taking time out of your day and joining us on something that's very near and dear and very important to us. We are coming live to you from Casa Armando here. I'm with Jeff Seringer. We're going to talk to you about clear ice, how to make it at home, potentially how to scale it up so that you can use it in your establishment as well. We're going to do mostly demo, but we're going to talk a little bit about, what ice is, what water is. Jeff is going to chime in a little bit on the physics of it as well, but we want to keep it interesting, and I urge you to ask questions. I think the interactivity of question and answer is what's going to make this seminar the best, quite frankly. I may not have all the answers. I'm going to speak to you from my experience. I'm fortunate enough to have a pretty good-sized drop-down chest freezer in my garage, and so I make clear ice at home. That's all we use. We're sort of snobs. I think it's important to state the importance of ice and sometimes how overlooked it is when it comes to cocktails. We choose our juices, we choose our modifiers, we choose our spirits of the highest quality, right? But ice is equally as important, right? So what is ice, right? Ice is frozen water. So it is water in its solid state, right? As we know, water, H2O, is a molecule, 2 hydrogen atoms connected to 1 oxygen atom in the middle. Essentially, it looks like a boomerang, and water is amazing. It is something that passes through all states of matter. If you've ever made pasta before, you boil water. Steam is water in its gas form. Water as we know it, drinking water, whatnot. Jump in a pool, the ocean, that's water in its liquid form. Water in its solid form is ice, right? Some of the other physical properties are that it's clear, meaning that it's see-through, right? And it's also colorless, so it has no color of its own, but it does refract light, which is pretty cool. Why does water freeze? Well, any bit of matter, including water, right, has molecules that are moving rapidly while it's in its liquid state, specifically for us at room temperature. They bounce off each other, they ricochet, right? And as the temperature drops and approaches 0 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, as it gets colder, those molecules slow down, okay? So they don't move nearly as rapidly. There's less potential energy, and essentially when it reaches what we know is freezing point, those molecules stick together. I'm going to throw it to Jeff for a moment so that he can speak to the physical formation of those molecules. Speak up.
Oh, speak up. Okay. Yes. So if you think about water, it's kind of simply think of it as a triangle, where you have a point of the triangle being oxygen and 2, legs going off the sides are hydrogen. Oxygen pulls electrons a little more closely, and electrons are negatively charged. I'm not going to get too geeky here, but what that does is cause a unequal distribution of charge. So on the oxygen side, it tends to be more negatively charged, partially charged, and on the hydrogen side, it's more positively charged. And what that is, when you think about opposites attract, that allows for positives and negatives to interact. And so when you're in a gas form, thermal energy is kinetic energy converted to kinetic energy, so they're going all over the place. they don't interact so much. When you are in liquid form, what happens is that they have a much better chance of interacting. And so that's where you get the viscosity of water, which is actually, we see all these things in real life and we don't think about it. But the fact that there's this flowing substance that has form that fills areas, it's really quite amazing. Except, yeah, as John says, this is less geeky. That's about as less geeky as I tend to go, but I'll try to even make it less geeky. It's pretty amazing that you can have something that's kind of, you can put your hand in, but it's still a solid in sense. But when you really reduce the temperature, again, you're reducing thermal energy, reduces kinetic energy. They get to interact more, and you have less of that energy trying to break them apart. So the negative comes to the positives, and you can form basically a lattice. And when that lattice forms, there's actually more space in between the molecules that causes it to have a less dense form than liquid, and therefore it floats. So I don't think we need to talk anymore about that.
So if we were to draw it into a diagram, and in doing some research for this, listening to some podcasts, the analogy that they used were jacks. And if you remember the old game jacks, where you bounce the ball and you pick them up, water in its liquid form would be like a pile of jacks. How they all sort of just kind of fit and kind of commingle with one another. When water goes to its solid form, it would be as if the jacks were sort of stuck together, but perfectly like a jungle gym, if you will. And water, again, is an absolutely amazing thing. Bruce Lee's philosophy was be water, because water is something that really forms to its environment, and it can withstand just about anything. A couple other interesting things about water and ice specifically is that, as Jeff stated, ice is less dense. So water in its solid form is less dense than in its liquid form. Now, typically speaking, when it comes to physics and things like that, when matter gets warm, it tends to expand, right? And when it gets cool, it tends to contract. However, when water freezes, it actually expands, which decreases its density by about 9%, which is basically why iceberg float, okay? So the next kind of just little housekeeping thing that we're going to talk about is what affects the freezing process. Okay, there are 4 specific things that affect the freezing process. There's dissolved solids, okay? There's water density, there's pressure, and then there's movement, okay? So when it comes to dissolved solids, we're talking about minerals. Most often you'll find calcium, magnesium, sodium, chlorides, and other minerals in water, okay? If you were to talk to somebody who wants to sell you a filtration system, a water filtration system, they'll tell you that total dissolved solids of 50 parts per million are ideal. The 2019 water quality report from Palm Beach County stated that the total dissolved solids in our drinking water are between 231 and 242 parts per million. So you're like, okay, what's that mean, right? So basically it'll affect potentially taste, flavor, right? So we want our ice to be neutral. We don't want to unless we're doing it intentionally in a compound ice cube, we don't want our water to taste like anything. It'll also affect clarity in terms of the cloudiness, okay? So I think most of us typically have access to water that's filtered. Now, I just use water straight out of the tap. At home, we do have a reverse osmosis system. I've never made a point to use necessarily distilled water or bottled water, and the results have been pretty damn good. Okay. Secondly, freezing process, water density, right? And let's think about seawater, right? The water is going to be a little more dense because of the salt content, and as we know, the temperature drops. It becomes lower by about 3 to 5 degrees to freeze salt water. We don't necessarily have that in our application, but certainly something to know. What I do use to make my clear ice is just this handy dandy cooler that you can either get at Walmart, right? This particular one, I think I got at Publix. They're about $10. I have two different sizes. I have a larger one as well. This one fits about, I think it's like 13 cans, and this is about 6 cans. Now, the key to making clear ice, since we don't have fancy machines that, like the ice plant might have or the aviary, which still is the same principle of directional freezing. What they use is a large machine with a cold plate on the bottom. The water freezes from the bottom up. They keep the water moving, and essentially they get basically 100% yield, or damn near close to 100% yield. This is the same concept of directional freezing. The key to is the cooler, the lid comes off, okay? So we fill it with water. It's insulated on 5 out of the 6 sides. So if you have the Tavolo molds at home or just regular ice molds that you put in your freezer, they're not necessarily insulated. So they freeze all around, right? And what makes ice not clear is any gas or impurities or any of those dissolved solids that can't escape. So as we use this, it'll freeze top down. It pushes all of those impurities towards the bottom. Now, the one caveat with this is, unfortunately, we don't get 100% yield. If you look at this piece right here, this is a block that came out of this cooler, and you can see that we have impurities and gas right here, okay? Now, the reason this happened is because we're displaced at the moment. We had a flood in our house. We're not in our house right now. So I left this in the freezer longer than it should have been. So for the smaller cooler, for me, it's between 24 and 36 hours. And it depends. It depends on how much ice is already in my freezer. It depends on if there's ice buildup on the inside of the freezer, if I've defrosted it, right? The cleaner it is, the faster it goes. So in an ideal world, what I want the freezing to stop about right here, okay? And again, that's about 24 hours for the small one. It's about 48 hours for the large one. Now, what we would have is a little shell that comes all the way down here on all sides, and there would be water suspended in the middle, okay? So all of the impurities, any gas that's in there, would be suspended in the water, and it wouldn't be frozen. So all of this would be clear. And as you can see, we have a couple few inches of beautifully clear ice. Now, is this block toast? Absolutely not. It's going to take a little extra work. If I had a bandsaw, then I could rip it off and it'd be glorious, but I don't have that. So what I would do is I would put it in my sink, and I'd probably run warm water. I'd start with cold, and then I'd up the temperature a little bit, and I would essentially just kind of melt this all off. Or I might take my trusty knife. My tool of choice is just this bread knife that I got in culinary school, basically 15 years ago, and I use an ice hammer. Okay, and so I could whack that off, and it wouldn't be a perfect shape, but it would certainly knock this off. Now, in the ideal world, when I take it out and it has the shell in the water, I kind of cut that off. I either use the excess ice for just, water or cocktails, or I take those ice shards and I throw them back in the cooler, and then I fill it up with water, which lowers the temperature of the water in the cooler, which helps the ice freeze a little bit faster. Okay? Now, I'm going to show you right here a block that's already been processed. So this one has been sitting in my freezer for a little while. I let it sit in just a hotel pan because aluminum is an amazing conductor of heat, and so if you have a flat pan, it'll help kind of even it out, because ideally we want really nice shapes, right? We want as close to square as possible. Not only does it stay really cold for a very long time and doesn't over dilute your cocktail, but it looks pretty awesome. When you can take your low ball and look down through, an old fashioned and see your hand under the bottom of the glass, I'd say you're pretty stoked there. So as I digress, we're going to start cutting this into some shapes. You can do Collins cubes, which are the longer, slender ones. You can do cubes for an old-fashioned, typically somewhere around 2 by 2. It all depends on the size of your glass. Today we have these 10.5-ounce old-fashioned glasses, so that should fit really nicely. The other really important variable, and one of my favorite words, is tempering. So tempering is bringing your ice sort of up to room temperature. If you were to just take this right out of the freezer and try to start cutting it, it would basically just fracture and shatter in ways that you had no control over. So by letting it warm up, you're gaining more control. Now, to put it into perspective, I had about 4 of these. We were just up in DC for a wedding, and we brought a cooler with some food and some snacks and stuff like that. And I had like 3 blocks of these in that cooler, and 2 of them, with the help of a little bit of bagged ice that I put in the cooler to keep the temperature down, 2 of these blocks made it 5 days. Like, there was still ice left after 5 days. So this beautiful, dense, really cold block ice has a really long lifespan. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start by eyeing it. If you want it to be more precise, you could use the tape measure. You could notch it. I just really enjoy this. It's sort of therapeutic for me. Ideally, I'd have a band saw, right? As you see, if you follow Ghost Ice Systems or some of the other things on Instagram, you can see they do it in much more of an industrial fashion, and the products that they're getting are much more uniform, right? So this is just for doing it at home, right? So we're just going to take our bread knife, serrated knife. We're going to go about yay, and then we're just going to begin to score back and forth. If I wanted to, I could continue to just saw like this, and eventually, it won't cut all the way through, but it will eventually fracture. So now that I got a good groove there, what I like to do in the way my knife works is I bring the end all the way over here, and then I actually tilt it to the right a little bit, because when I use the ice mallet to hit it, I'm coming down to the left. So when I tilt it to the right, it's basically going to fracture it, hopefully, pretty damn close to straight down. You could tap on it gently. I've found that setting it right and then just completely committing and then one swift whop is the best way to do it. And I also, because my handle is a little kind of rubbery plastic, it helps protect the hammer a little bit, and it also helps fracture the ice nicely and evenly. See, so not perfect, but that's okay. So we got a little here, all right? So from here, I would probably cut this. Give it a whap. Not too bad. What I like to use also is a sheet pan, because again, the aluminum or the stainless steel is a really good conductor. So if I wanted to flatten this guy out, then I could kind of keep it here and get the edges nice and smooth and nice and flat, okay? Every block is a little different. It's sort of like a thumbprint, sort of like a human. They're not going to all be the same. Some of them are much easier to work with than others. A lot of it has to deal with the temperature, the ambient temperature, the environment, whatnot. So let's see if we can make a Collins cube here. That one fractured a little bit better. And I also use these while I'm cutting the other cubes. Kind of help. The sink works. We were up in St. Augustine a handful of weeks ago, visiting some friends, Annie and Andrew Blake. The Airbnb they had a sink which had perfect right angles on it, and it was glorious because I could take this cube, put it in the clean, sanitized sink, obviously, sort of rub it up against the edges and square it off beautifully. Now we're just going to go like Yay. And there are lots, I mean, these are just remedial tools. You know, there are so many tools you can buy out there. We just have not upgraded. Boom. So we got those right there. Those are maybe a little large. We could probably break these down one more time. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see that right there, but this little spot right here, as I was cutting, it started to fracture. So if I wanted, I could continue to cut, and this is going to break. It may not break where I want it, but it'll happen. Well, then we'll leave those to kind of square up a little bit, and they're just some nice Collins cubes, and then we'll use our original technique. Bam. Just like that. Pretty nice. Okay. And then we have, this beauty right here. Which will go nicely there. This particular knife I'm a fan of for many reasons. Because one, it's just sort of all-purpose. Right, but then even when we have something like this, which sort of sits a little awkward, a little cockeyed, we can take our knife and begin to square it off so that we can get it as close as possible, to a cube. If you have the three-pronged ice pick, I know Cocktail Kingdom sells them. I'm sure there's other places you can get them as well. At this point, you could take that. I don't have one today, unfortunately. You could whack at it with that pick, and you could form a sphere as well. When you get this kind of as square as you can. And these are great for snowballs, too. If you want to just spice it up a little bit, you have a little snowball fight. Just don't put them in the freezer, because then it becomes a deadly weapon. That's not cool. Ice ball, different than snowball. From here, if we wanted to, we could make something similar to a diamond by starting on the corners, tapering them down.
David, while you're doing that, we had a question. When you're taking out a clear ice cube from the freezer to take to behind the bar, sometimes the temperature drops and my clear ice will crack and my perfect cube will be ruined. What do you recommend?
Okay, so that actually happened. I don't know if Jeff can get a good shot of this, but this particular block I left outside. Again, these froze longer than I wanted to, so they didn't come out nearly as easy. I put them outside, and you can see these little fractures right here. Actually, it was a result of sunlight. It was because the sun beat down on them and heated them up too much. What I would suggest is I'd say roll with it, because I've had plenty of situations where that happens. It's still clear ice, right? Sometimes you get little cracks in it, you get little fractures in it, but it's still clear and you can see through it. And it actually looks pretty damn cool, which is completely different than it being cloudy ice, right? Because as you know, with the Tavolo or whatever, you still have that little sort of amoeba of like cloudiness, whiteness in there. It's going to be crystal clear. I'd say shake it off and just roll with it. I don't know if that answered the question, but at that point, there's nothing that you can do about it. So it really takes. So basically, when I take the coolers out of the freezer, I leave them in the garage uncovered, and depending on if the garage is open, depending on how warm it is that day, it takes anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes, approximately, for me to be able to flip the cooler over in the sink and have it come out easily. Then I let it sit for a little bit longer. I mean, the key is tempering. I mean, when you make a block that's, a few inches thick, even if you let it sit for an hour, you're not going to lose that much yield, right? So it's okay. So err on the side of caution when it comes to tempering. Temper. I'm just going to finish this guy up. Got these corners here. And although she's not perfect, this way, she's still pretty. All right. What else? We have other questions?
You pour something over there?
We should. Oh, and actually, that's an interesting point. In my experience, I kind of fell into a conundrum with these, right? Because let's say you're somebody that likes whiskey, right? And you want it on a beautiful cube like this, right? What do we typically do procedure-wise as bartenders, right? We just pour the neat spirit right over, correct? Well, in my experience, I found that neat spirit, because it's room temperature and because it's high proof, is going to crack that ice cube. So, sort of, I guess you kind of you gotta use your better judgment. But what I've done is I've taken a shaker tin and I've taken that spirit, poured it over ice literally for seconds in that shaker tin, and then poured it over the big cube. Therefore, the spirit temperature has dropped enough that the cube isn't going to crack. And we also know that the cube is cold, big enough, dense enough that it's not going to over dilute the spirit. They want it on the rocks anyway, so there's going to be a little bit of dilution. But that's sort of my technique for maintaining the integrity of that cube. Because why put a clear cube in there, a beautiful, clear block of ice in there, and then pour something over it and automatically have it crack? And I know y'all can hear that sound when it does it, and I know I cringe when that happens. But with that said, it's not completely the end of the world.
David, can we run that experiment with farm stock rye?
We certainly can. No issues. So there's no issues with this one. And my suspicion is because it's really, really, really tempered, right? Now, if we were at a bar or if we were at our house, it's very likely that we would be pulling that cube out of the freezer, so it would no longer be tempered. So I'm going to backpedal a little bit and say that if you have a tempered cube, you can pour neat spirit over it without fear of it cracking. But if you're pulling that cube from the freezer, where it's probably approached 0 degrees again, because that's typically, where freezers are at. Obviously, we know that, freezing point is 32 degrees, but typically the freezers that we work with are about 0 degrees, which is much, much colder, and so that will crack. Did I see another question?
Stamping ice.
That I don't have a lot of experience with. But with that said, non-heated ice stamps, I would imagine are, metal. Metal is a great conductor of heat, and so you wouldn't necessarily need it. You'd probably need pressure. Would probably be the key. Pressure and time.
Because they have the sphere formers that aren't heat dependent.
Correct.
Yeah. So
and you could certainly use. There are methods for making clear ice spheres. From what I've seen, you take those Tavolo ones with the gray silicone and sort of the semi-opaque plastic. You fill them up, and then you put them inverted into a cocktail shaking tin, and so that way all the impurities can be released through the little hole there. But if you happen to have, maybe it's the Cocktail King ice ball maker, the Macallan one, or whatever. You're just going to want to cut yourself a block large enough to fit in there, and then you're going to get, and I kind of dream about that, but you're going to get a beautifully crystal clear sphere. All right, so I'm gonna just try to cut off this impurity right here. It doesn't typically fracture so easily, so I'm gonna do a little extra work, and I'm gonna actually score it on all sides.
Is it harder, easier, or the same to cut through the impurity versus the clear?
In my experience, it's more difficult to cut through the impurity. Because there's probably minerals, there's gas in there, and so it really just wants to break. It doesn't want to break off nicely or easily. So usually, what I'm anticipating when I do this is that in this area, in the perimeter, it's going to break off nicely. But right in the middle here, we're still going to have some of this cloudy stuff because it's not going to want to go anywhere. And then the method that I would use would be to go to the sink and then use sort of indirect water flow around it. I wouldn't submerge it in water, but if you keep it in running water, and then once it gets tempered like this, you can hit it with pretty hot water without fear of it going crazy and breaking by itself. You just don't want to run water on it. If you run water on it immediately, it's going to crack. If you run water on it later on, it's going to form a dimple. Obviously, it's going to start melting it. That's not really what we want. So that actually worked
Very nice.
way better than I anticipated. So the extra work of scoring it all the way around really helped. And as you can see, now we have all this. And again, I would actually probably take this. I'd probably take this block. I'd probably put it back in the cooler, fill it up with water, let it melt a little bit, which then again keeps the water temperature pretty low, and then throw it back in the freezer. Because even though this is not an ideal piece of ice for us, right, it's going to melt, and then when it freezes, everything is going to be pushed down. And so again, a lot of it is about trial and error with the equipment that you have. You can do this in your freezer at home, in the kitchen freezer. You can do it in a drop-down freezer, right? You could even do it in a much larger format if you had, let's say, a walk-in freezer at your establishment. I mean, I've made clear blocks in this particular cooler, which is probably 18 inches wide, 18 by 12 by 12 maybe. And again, it's going to take a little bit longer, but if you work at an establishment where you have freezer space, because it's really all about freezer space, and you have time, then you can implement these techniques and produce clear ice and use it at your bar. When I was at the Regional, I was kind of dabbling, with this. We had an off-site walk-in freezer at our commissary that I was able to use, and so I had but very, very little freezer space on site. So I was able to, have a very small inventory of clear ice for some regulars or some special guests or some special cocktails. At the house, we have quite a bit of clear ice. It's really all we use. So we're very fortunate.
So is there any difference between using deionized water versus different methods of filtration, or is it not that functionally?
In my experience, I haven't paid super close attention to the water source that I'm using. Again, it's either been the water source at home, which is reverse osmosis. It's been from one of the sinks at the restaurant, which, they're going to have some sort of filtration. I mean, I've also used, I think these right here, these were bottled water that I used because I needed to fill them. We didn't have running water at the house at the time. So I went and bought spring water from Publix and used that. I personally don't notice any difference or variation in clarity or in taste, for that matter.
In research, clinical research, you could potentially find a statistically significant difference between two methodologies But when you put it out into the field, through clinical trials, there's functionally no difference between one patient to another patient, so maybe, but does it really matter when you're putting it in a glass and someone's drinking from it and it looks beautiful? Yeah.
Right. Like, might you get the most best, purest form if you use bottled distilled water? Possibly, right? Over just filtered tap water versus spring water or drinking water. Sure, if you were doing it scientifically and you were rating those things, but all things being equal in all of those things side by side, would our guest, would we see any difference, notice any difference? I would say that's unlikely, but my ears are also open to be proven wrong. So, more questions? Has anybody that's part of this meeting right now? Has anybody dabbled in clear ice? Does anybody have anything to weigh in on that maybe I missed, or perhaps to debunk, or perhaps in their experience, something, tricks, trade secrets that they might have? Cow?
Hey, David, I have a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry if you already answered. I'm kind of like on and off with the signal.
That's okay.
Do you know anything about, let's say, like now with viruses and bacteria? Do viruses and bacteria die? Let's say we touch the water with dirty hands or whatever and freeze the ice. Does it die, or it prevents it until it's melted? Do they come back alive, or?
To the best of my knowledge, and this is based on my experience in taking multiple ServSafe classes, the only way to kill virus and bacteria is with heat and hitting those critical high temperatures, which is why we have internal cooking temperatures for steak, pork, chicken, et al. Right? Freezing basically puts them in sort of limbo. It basically presses pause. They don't die. They still exist, and then upon thawing out, then they will come back to life. So the only way is by heat to kill those organisms.
Yeah, freezing is not a method of sterilization. You can decrease an infectious organism's infectivity, especially if you go ahead and repeated freeze-thaw cycles where you actually form crystals and they cut through membranes and so forth. But absolutely not. It is not a method of sterilization by any stretch.
So that water should be handled just like food, correct?
It is food. It is absolutely. It is. Water is food. Ice is food. So yes, 100%. There are also some interesting techniques to kind of mess around with, and I don't know. It doesn't necessarily pertain per se to clear ice, right? But you can make compound ice cubes, right? I know Rob is a big fan, and myself as well, of sort of the evolution cocktail, right? So if you make a compound ice cube, a flavored cube, I make this passion fruit syrup. It's equal parts water, 1-to-1 honey syrup and passion fruit puree from like Boiron or whatever your favorite one is. Makes a great passion fruit syrup. We used to do just a standard daiquiri over that passion fruit cube, and the daiquiri would slowly turn into a passion fruit daiquiri, and it was pretty cool. I've also seen people do, you take water, put it in a hotel pan, put it in the oven, and you can actually smoke it and give the water a smoky characteristic. So in theory, you could do, this is just coming to me, you could do a clear smoked ice cube in your smoked old fashioned without the pomp and circumstance of actually doing the whole smoke, which I get the consumer and the guests love, but I never thought of that. That might actually be kind of cool too. So you could sort of flavor your water and turn it into flavored cubes, whether it have color and be compound or whether it just be flavored and clear. I mean, it's sort of limitless. It's kind of like, use your imagination, which I know we all have, which is why all of y'all are as good as you are at what you do in our industry. So,
I mean, I'm not an expert by no means. I have tried smoking ice before and had not much success transferring the flavor to the cocktail, but I feel if the ice were to form a water film, like melt a little bit,
Mhm.
you'd probably have more success. But that's like almost adding a little liquid smoke into
Yeah.
the drink as opposed to getting it into the ice cube.
Yep.
I don't know what would happen if you went ahead and smoked the water and then made ice. Okay,
Solid question. I'm just gonna, well, we got a few minutes remaining. This is just one of the other techniques that I use. I like to score. Sometimes I like to score it. I don't always do it like this because, as with many things, when I'm cutting ice, I don't always know what I'm doing or what I want. But if I know that I'm going to be consistent and just, let's say, take this block and, whack it up in this particular manner, then I'll just score it all the way. And kind of do this work on the front end. And obviously we would be using gloves if, we were serving this to guests.
It's just me.
But they're not all perfect. We lost that one.
Yeah.
And normally, do it separately. Then I can take this guy, have that. Oh, there you are. Come back here, you silly little thing. Oh, Ross. And then we can do whatever we want with these. I could cut each of these into 4, make shaking ice out of it, make stirring ice. I mean, obviously we have, we got this guy. I mean, this will fit nicely in there. Bam. The one thing that I have, one of the things that I've noticed also or have been mindful of is like I love these big cubes, right? And I got this glass and it fits in there. But then the question is there still enough room in the glass for the cocktail? So it doesn't need to take up the whole damn glass. But I can tell you that if we were to put an old fashioned over this, depending on how quickly you drink them, that cube would last for at least 2 old fashions, proper like.
So does less ice mean more booze?
Double means you came more. Good one, Jeff. Let's see. More questions? Any more questions? Is there a method to incorporate garnishes? Yes. Okay, there is. I don't know how to do that, right? I was listening to a podcast yesterday. The method would be you would begin the freezing process, and then, this again would take some serious trial and error, but what you would do is you would begin the freezing process, and then you would need some sort of lattice or grate over the top of the cooler, and then you would need little alligator clips, right? Submerge them and hang them there until it began to freeze around it. Now that's something that I would like to mess around with, but it's not something that I've done. But that's what you would have to do. You'd have to begin the freezing process, put a grate over the top, suspend what you wanted to freeze into the cube there, and then again with this particular method, there would be some margin of error. Suspending it with a little clip would sort of ensure that you were able to space them out how you wanted to, because I think that would be the key, right? Because mostly we would think, right, what do? We just freeze it, we throw some in, and then they all sink to the bottom, and then they're all intertwined, and then it doesn't look nearly as pretty, or they're not in the right place where we would want them to be. So that's the method that I would use, and that I would certainly mess around with. But so most important things to remember: directional freezing. Okay, make sure you have enough space. Make sure you fill your cooler all the way up. Make sure your cooler's clean. Also, take into consideration the freezing space that you're using, because depending on what's in there, water will absorb flavors. And then it's going to, again, be a little trial and error as how long it takes for, your particular cooler to freeze. And then it just kind of becomes routine. Jeff, I think you were going to ask something?
Well, it's just totally esoteric. I was wondering if you've done anything or heard anybody who's tried to freeze like caviar or spheres. You think they would float or sink, depending on what they are. But
Yeah.
it would be interesting if you could potentially have something. You might need like little attachments on either side of the sphere, but have it centralized within a frozen cube and have a sphere of a spirit.
Right. I mean, there's plenty of technology out there, so I suppose it depends on what you want to commit, financially to it. This particular method is practical for home because it's low investment.
Yeah.
I've actually run into situations I've ruined at least 3 of the coolers by letting them freeze all the way, and then it cracks the plastic on the bottom, and then you're completely screwed. So again, that's why sort of timing is important. I'm not surprised, or I'm actually surprised that it didn't happen to this one, because as you could see how the bulge on the bottom here, right, and that tells me that it froze all the way when it shouldn't.
I wonder what would happen if you did something like saran wrap or cut over a bag to fit in there that would be a bit of a sliding surface between the ice and the actual cooler.
To me, and
So it would rise up.
again, in my experience, not necessary.
Okay.
Not necessary, because if you get it right, and usually like the best I've gotten is about 80% yield,
Yeah.
typically about 75%. If you give it 15 or 20 minutes, maybe up to 30 minutes, depending on the environment, and you just put it into the sink, you may have to push down on the bottom a little bit just to give it a little oomph. But most of the time they slide right out beautifully. You just got to make sure, you got to be careful that you're sort of supporting it. You don't want that block falling out of the cooler, slamming into the sink. It has the potential to break into pieces there. It has the potential to break something else, maybe your hand.
Can you make cubes with green chartreuse?
No.
Okay.
You can make whipped cream with green chartreuse, but
Wow.
you wouldn't do that. You would just put it in a cup. Maybe put a little less. But you would just pour yellow.
Well, I'll go for green, but
Do we have any other questions, comments, anything of the like? I really appreciate everybody's time. This was really fun. It was a really cool day. I'm honored and happy to be a part of this, and I hope you got something out of this. I'm pretty easy to find, so you have my contact information. If there's any questions, any follow-up questions that you might have for me.
is commercial ice a financially viable option?
I think it depends on your structure. In my opinion, paying $1 for a piece of ice, which adds immediately to the bottom line of your cocktail, I'm not a fan of it. If it's built into the program and into the economics, then I say go for it, right? Because there are obviously ice companies out there that can provide these things for you. But especially in times like this where things have been more difficult than they've ever been, profitability has become more important than ever, and to add $1 to a cocktail just for a piece of ice, to me that's tough.
Okay.
So.
Well, we have all this extra ice in case somebody wants to come over.
Yeah, that's not bad. 65 cents for a 2x2, 80 cents. Yeah, it's still not cheap though, right? Because we're in the business of providing our guests. We take pride in what we put into our cocktails, and so we already have to sort of be picky and figure out how to get bottle price down. I mean, the stuff that we like to pour and like to serve isn't the cheap stuff. We're not talking Aristocrat. We're not talking plastic bottles where it's under $1 to pour an entire cocktail. Sometimes when we get into those expensive modifiers, chartreuse included, and you're talking $2, $2.50, $3 a cocktail, and we don't want to gouge our guests. We don't want to have to charge them. We're not in Manhattan, we're not in LA, we're not in Chicago, There's a ceiling, I think, on how much we can charge for a cocktail, and so we got to be mindful of the ingredients that we put in without sacrificing, quality and ethics and just the things that we hold near and dear.
Is there anything, or would it be off-putting to have almost tiers of cocktails? Where like if somebody wanted to, it's often, I find, at least in what I do, one sometimes makes an error in assuming that something is too much for the client, that they aren't willing to do that, and so they actually get upset if you don't offer it to them. But is it off-putting to say, okay, I can serve you this, but I'll charge you $1 more for cube ice? Or is there any way to approach that in a way that's not going to piss people off?
I think it's being mindful of your clientele and of your demographic. And we're all people. Obviously, we have relatively good communication skills since we all work behind bars and work in restaurants and deal with people on a daily basis. So you gotta size them up. And again, it depends on your venue. If you're at the Pelican Club, people are looking for an experience, and that might be part of it. If you're
that scenario, I guess one wouldn't even ask if you asked me.
You would just go with it,
right?
Yeah.
But is there a scenario where you're catering to like the happy hour crowd versus
Well, again, and again, that's knowing your crowd, right? Because the happy hour crowd, some of them stop ordering drinks once happy hour is over. Right. Rob may be able to speak to this in his situation at the beach, right? Because there may be a percentage of the clientele that would love that, and they jump at that, and perhaps there's another percentage of the clientele that are at the beach and they see the tiki bar there and they're just looking for the deal. So that maybe that's like the middle ground situation or something similar to that. I don't know.
I'm curious about the psychological approach, because people either feel cheated perhaps or people feel pissed off. It's like I've heard that all the time. It's like, why would I pay $1 extra, for ice? Just cools. Ice only cools things down. And there's this whole other discussion around what ice really does versus the community perception of it. And, I could make ice at home, and okay.
I think it falls in a few categories, right? There's the sector that's not going to ask questions and they're not going to care, right? And so you should do that, and you should offer it to them because they want the best. There's the sector that you might have to have a conversation with. You may have to educate them a little bit on it, and they may be willing to learn and wanting to learn. And then there's the sector that wants to get what they want, but they want to spend the least amount for it. And there's not one is better than the other, right? We just kind of got to keep our head on a swivel and assess who we're who's in front of us, who we're on stage for at the time. Voila.
Okay.
I think that's all I got.
Well, thank you, David. That was wonderful.
I hope that was helpful. And again, if there's anything that you'd like me to clarify, any questions, if
clarify.
You're fine.
or if there's anything that I misspoke about, then and somebody knows better than certainly please chime in and let me know, because it's for me it's like an evolutionary process. I'm constantly learning and wanting to learn more and experimenting, and I love ice. In an ideal world, I'd be wearing a jacket like this and probably a woolly in a walk-in freezer area that's reminiscent of the winters where I grew up, playing around with a bandsaw that could cut off all my limbs if I didn't act right, cutting up beautiful blocks of ice. That is pretty cool. I like how you did that. I wonder what it looks on the other side. There you go.
Oh.
So look at that. Can we see that?
Yeah, hold on.
That's so cool.
It actually, so Jeff had this So I guess that answers the non-heat stamp question.
That's a reaction.
As he just did.
Can you pour in something that's colored? Now we're just playing. I know. Don't want to waste. Like some bitters. Actually, I meant pour some bitters on top of that.
Pour
Some
bitters and pour yellow chartreuse on top.
That's green. I have yellow somewhere.
You have yellow. It's right behind me on my left.
Oh, do I? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a problem when I forget to do that.
It's freaking cold, dude.
Kind of vanished. Drop some bitters on top of that if you can.
Absolutely not.
You're gonna ruin the chartreuse.
Experiment. Drink it, then put some bitters on it. Now, at this point, people can probably leave because we're just screwing off here.
All right, guys. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today for our USBG Palm Beach Education Day. I want to thank Oceana, Matthews Brewing Company, Nick Hogan and Jen Michelle from Mover and Shaker, and of course David Bouchard. What was I supposed to say, Rob?
The
That the recording of this will be on all of our social media outlets on both of our Facebook pages if anybody missed it or they want to go back to recall something and go over something. So thank you guys again so very much. And yeah, I guess, Rob, anything you want to say?
You killed it. Thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you guys at our next meeting on the November 3rd, first Tuesday of the month.
Hey, thanks, guys.